you think the end is in sight?
Well, the end, the end of this phase is still a few days away. But the first 5 days, Russian forces, I think, frankly, were too gentle. They've now corrected that. So I would say another 10 days, this should be completely over.
The gentleman in severe need of a lozenge in that video is a retired US Army Colonel, Douglas Macgregor, who actually served as a Defense Department advisor under Trump. He's making quite a name for himself as he has called for Ukraine to immediately surrender to Russia, and that slight criticism that you heard of Russia in that video is the only criticism he has offered, that Russia has been too gentle with Ukraine. And then he lauded Putin for intensifying its attacks against the Ukrainians. Now, he later calls Vladimir Zelensky a puppet, but before we get to that video, I wanted to get to another part of his interview with Stuart Varney, where he spreads all sorts of propaganda that seems to be favorable toward Russia and Vladimir Putin. Let's watch.
Is he gonna flatten Ukraine?
No, absolutely not. In fact, he's worked hard to capture most of it intact. Surprisingly little damage, frankly, Stuart. Much less damage than we inflicted on Iraq when we went into it, either in '91 and again in 2003. Now, I think they're just surrounding the Ukrainian forces and they are annihilating them. And this is inevitable. And Mr. Zelensky, I think, is postponing the inevitable in the hopes that we are going to rescue him, and we are not coming. The Russians have made it very clear what they want is a neutral Ukraine. This could have ended days ago if he accepted that, and then they can adjust the borders. But the eastern part of Ukraine is firmly in Russian hands. But again, the Russians are not seizing territory, they're destroying Ukrainian forces. That's their focus.
They're just destroying Ukrainian forces, which is why more than 1,000 civilians have already died as a result of Russia's attacks in this war that's been going on for less than 2 weeks now. That's why millions of Ukrainians have fled the country, seeking refuge in neighboring European countries as a result of this brutality. And the lies about how the target is Ukrainian troops and nothing more is infuriating, especially since there's so much evidence to the contrary. In fact, let me give you a bit of that evidence right now. Let's watch.
The house collapsed on me, she says, and then they pulled me out. There are no other patients in this hospital. All the injured treated here died in their beds, we're told, including one 53-year-old man brought in on Sunday morning.
Just here.
Across town, the rockets, apparent cluster munitions that seem to fall just anywhere. So another rocket landed up the street here. From cars to vegetable gardens. Вот видишь. Спасибо. At the morgue, the toll is growing. At least 50 bodies, they told us. 20 of them incinerated in a Russian missile strike on the naval port of Charkiv, they said. The bodies so often of the elderly who would have survived being a Soviet citizen, but not this.
Just absolutely disgusting to repeat those kinds of lies on national television in regard to what Putin's really doing. What Putin's doing is incredibly brutal, and civilians are suffering the consequences of it, while that idiot goes on Fox News and pretends as though Putin's this lovely guy who's just doing the right thing,
Colonel Macgregor was in the United States military for decades. Then I'll tell you what happened afterwards that might have influenced the way he's thinking about things here. But one of the things you should know is he was an advisor to Donald Trump. And this is the kind of advice he gave him. If Trump was in office, God knows if he would have listened to him. And I could see Trump easily saying, well, they should have surrendered. That he prefers Ukrainians who surrender. And that's exactly what Colonel Macgregor just said on Fox News. He said the Russians are just annihilating the Ukrainians, as if it's a good thing. Then he said it's basically the Ukrainians' fault for not surrendering earlier. He's saying this all with a straight face. And then he said, if you notice, this is important. He said the Russians are not seizing territory. But a sentence earlier, he had said, well, then of course afterwards we'd have to adjust the borders.
Right, totally. Yeah.
But wait a minute, that's seizing territory, you propagandist prick. And so why is he doing propaganda for Putin? I don't know to what degree he's being directly paid, but he certainly was on RT many, many times. There are people who were on RT and did good work and didn't talk about Russia. But the ones that did were apparently heavily influenced by the checks they were receiving. What a surprise.
Well, I wanted to do a little digging to learn more about Colonel Macgregor, right? What kind of guy he is. And he had some strong thoughts after the annexation of Crimea. For instance, in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, he basically called for the annexation of Donbass. And said that residents of the region are in fact Russians, not Ukrainians. And at the same time, you have Ukrainians in the West and in the North who are not Russians.
And I'm gonna ask a legitimate question because I didn't hear the beginning of what you said.
Sure.
Was that Vladimir Putin or Colonel Macgregor?
That was Macgregor.
Okay, because that was identical to what Putin said.
No, in fact, why don't we talk a little more about what Putin has said, right? Because listen, I think there's legitimate criticism in regard to NATO and how it could lead to these types of provocations. However, as I've said multiple times, since the invasion of Ukraine, Putin had his mindset on invading no matter what. Zelensky said joining NATO might just be a dream. He was giving up his bid to be part of NATO in order to de-escalate the situation. Days later, we covered that story. Check it out on our YouTube page, our Facebook page, you'll find it, okay? Days after that, Putin invaded anyway, because it's about installing a puppet government. He doesn't even see Ukraine as a legitimate country. He thinks it should be a buffer state. Because who cares about the people of Ukraine? Who cares about self-determination? He wants a puppet government, he wants a buffer state, right? Now here's what he had said in his speech prior to the invasion. Ukraine actually never had stable traditions of real statehood. That's a direct quote from Vladimir Putin. Here's more. By the way, at the end of World War I, Ukraine declared independence from Russia, and it was put back under Soviet rule by force, okay, after that. He also said, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us, it is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russian or Russians. So exact type of statement that you would hear from Colonel Macgregor, right? Now, to give you more from this guy, he then goes on to specifically attack Vladimir Zelensky. I want to hear about those attacks and then we'll debunk that as well.
Colonel, it sounds like you don't approve of Zelensky's stand.
Oh, I think Zelensky is a puppet. And he is putting huge numbers of his own population at unnecessary risk. And quite frankly, most of what comes out of Ukraine is debunked as lies within 24 to 48 hours. The notions of taking and retaking airfields, all of this is nonsense. It hasn't happened.
He's not a hero when he's standing up for himself and his own people? You don't think he's a hero?
No, I do not. I don't see anything heroic about the man. And I think the most heroic thing that he can do right now is to come to terms with reality. Neutralize Ukraine. This is not a bad thing. A neutral Ukraine would be good for us as well as for Russia. It would create the buffer that frankly both sides want. But he's, I think, being told to hang on and try to drag this out, which is tragic for the people that have to live through this.
It would create the buffer that both sides want. I think it's pretty clear considering the pretty harsh, the fact that all these people in Ukraine are fighting back so aggressively. I think it's pretty clear that that's not what the people of Ukraine want. They don't want to be a buffer state to appease Vladimir Putin. And the idea that Vladimir Zelensky should just neutralize, like give up immediately, neutralize the country, give Putin everything he wants. That's what the brave thing is? Like that's the brave strategy according to this clown?
Yeah, Colonel Macgregor really should tell us where he makes his money.
Seriously.
Because that's just total insanity and direct Russian propaganda. That's not, hey, around the edges, and where should the natural borders of NATO be? That's an interesting, legitimate question. He said we should neutralize Ukraine, and that it would be good for everybody, including the Ukrainians. I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians don't feel that getting neutralized is helping them, or as he bragged about in that same segment a little earlier, getting annihilated. That the Ukrainians did not sign up for annihilation or being neutralized. And do you think they'd be neutralized? Well, Colonel Macgregor said earlier they shouldn't be. They should adjust the borders, that it shouldn't be neutral. That Russia should just take the land and then presumably unilaterally adjust the borders so they have more of Ukraine. And then Colonel Macgregor can collect a big paycheck and cheer on Putin from his own goddamn home, okay? Or why doesn't he go in the middle of Ukraine and help his friend Vladimir Putin? So, by the way, this is extra dangerous. Stuart Varney's an idiot. After the interview was over, he's like, oh, some interesting things there I'm not sure I agree with, but all right, tell you. No, then why don't you challenge him, you fool? So, of course he doesn't. The reason why it's super dangerous, guys, is that once Fox News realizes this is ugly and putting on an obvious propagandist for Putin is not playing well even with our own base, him cheerleading the deaths of Ukrainian civilians, etc., is not playing well even with the monstrous right-wing Fox News base, they're gonna take him off. And then what's gonna happen? QAnon guys, right-wingers online, and even some of the fake left-wing will say, oh, the deep state took him off.
Censorship.
Censorship, and you know what? They were worried that he was revealing too much, and it'll help launch 1,000 conspiracies that are all against the Ukrainian people. That guy was choking in the beginning, presumably on his own talking points, but perhaps on something else, also sent by Putin.
I also think it's important for you all to know what kind of person Colonel Macgregor is outside of his terrible foreign policy commentary, and you'll get a sense of why it is that the Trump administration wanted him as an advisor for the Defense Department and all of that. So Macgregor, let's go to graphic 5 here. Macgregor also said a lot of criminals were among migrants and undocumented immigrants coming into the United States, adding they would be a burden on our economy who carried since eradicated diseases.
In other words, immigrants are criminals and diseased. It's literal Nazi propaganda. So it's not overly surprising that he would be in favor of the new Nazis, the Putin-led government.
And I want to go to this next video because he had some thoughts about what the Biden administration is doing when it comes to immigration into the United States. Let's watch.
Retired Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor says the Biden administration's policy is to bring in non-white immigrants to outnumber white Americans of European ancestry in the US. Listen.
The idea is that they have to bring in as many non-Europeans as possible in order to outnumber the numbers of Americans of European ancestry who live in the United States. That's what it's all about. And I don't think there's any point in questioning it. That is the policy.
So the whole white replacement theory garbage is something that he not only believes, but he spouts, propaganda about it when he's on the news, when he's talking to people. He also says, I think some of you must have seen the thousands of pregnant women coming up from Latin America so they can have their children here. And then the children immediately, the child is immediately declared an American citizen. And again, all of this is part of the grand plan. This is what Mr. Biden and his supporters want. They want another country. They don't want the United States. That's who this guy is. And where does he get invited on to share his so-called non-interventionist propaganda, which, by the way, he was a huge supporter of invading Iraq in 2003. Places like, oh wow, would you look at that? The Gray Zone. The Gray Zone, which also spouts pro-Putin propaganda nonstop. So let's go to graphic 4. Just like to show you the receipts, not just make statements. So there you have it. There's an example of an interview that they had with Macgregor pretty recently.
And they label him ex-Pentagon advisor as if he didn't say all those horrible right-wing, lunatic, racist things before, makes him seem legitimate. And who does Gray Zone blame for the Russian invasion of Ukraine? America. Of course, of course. You could have a nuanced discussion about the faults of American foreign policy and Russian foreign policy, and you would obviously be fair and say that Russia did the invasion here unquestionably, and it is overwhelmingly their fault. But do they say that? No, of course they don't say that, because they're doing propaganda for Putin's government. If they want to cry about that, they can go cry anywhere they like. They're monsters. So this Colonel Macgregor guy, right-wing racist all throughout. That's why Trump loved him. That's why he wanted him to be part of his government and wanted him to be ambassador to Germany. That is an incredibly important role for this clown of clowns. And now he's out there, oh, Putin's, poor Putin. Poor Putin. The Ukrainians made him do this, and America made him do this. We should immediately neutralize and annihilate Ukraine, readjust its borders, hand it over to our friend Putin. Go ahead, cheerlead for that, you scum. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, we really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.